distinguished panelists with us here today. Stephen Donofrio from CDP North America, which was referenced at least twice in the last half an hour. Elizabeth Selig from Conservation International, who will talk to us about the Ocean Health Index. And Ian Noble, who is a consultant to ND Gain and also a long participant in a variety of indicators in the climate change adaptation space. Each of them will talk about their own experiences, their own tools and data, and also trends and things they see coming down the pipe in terms of future application of data and tools. So with their permission, because we're talking about tools, and because maybe you've heard there is a tool that we are all here gathering to discuss, the GAIN Index, I'm going to break a little bit from tradition with the rest of today's panels and show a few slides myself. And you will hear more tomorrow about ND Gain in our press event and our release of our 2013 data and some interesting new results from the ND Gain. But I want to set the stage for thinking about these kind of tools and use ND Gain very briefly as an example. And this will be relevant for each of the panelists' presentations as well. So when we talk about adapting, we're talking about climate change, of course. But let's remember there are many forces acting that are changing the way our planet functions, and we need to adapt to those at the same time that we adapt to a changing climate. And we will claim on this panel, and certainly ND Gain would claim, that tools, data, and indices can help inform decision making and help us to understand these processes. And specifically, there's a growing marketplace for climate change adaptation. There are a few data points up here, dollar figures. The Green Climate Fund is an emerging source of resources. It's pledged $100 billion by 2020. There are projections for growth in the global infrastructure industry related to adaptation. Emerging natural disasters that are costing large amounts of money, several of which have been quite extreme in the recent past, and lots of emerging corporate executives seeing risks in their supply chains. And again, we would say, can tools and data and indices help to inform how these markets play out? And I guess I also neglected to, I'll introduce myself here when I show a couple of slides on ND Gain. There are a number of resources and tools available in the climate change adaptation space. We'll see a couple examples today. Here's a slide that lists a number. So there are a number of, these are individuals and organizations attempting to align information and put it in and put relevant information into the hands of decision makers. ND Gain is one of these resources. I'm Jessica Hellmann. I'm a professor of biology at the University of Notre Dame and the research lead on ND Gain, so I play a leadership role in the development and the application of ND Gain. ND Gain is one of these kinds of indicators. It's attempting to it gathers information and delivers it to users with an emphasis on the private sector, but with application to many other sectors, including the public sector and non-governmental organizations. So here, for example, is some analyses that we performed for Catholic Relief Services, where we show at the country level. This helped Catholic Relief Services envision all of the countries in which it has active programs. What are the risks and the opportunities that these countries experience? So the index helps inform an organization like Catholic Relief Services. But a good index, including ND Gain, will enable you to dig deeper and get into the data. You can look at it at country level, at the level of the entire index, but imagine you wanted to dive deeper. So here's a hypothetical example. Let's say you were a corporation. Let's say you were a bottling company and you were looking to expand operations in Southern Africa. Well, you might look at the index as a whole, but there might be certain dimensions of the index that are particularly informative. You might be interested in all countries, but you might also be interested in a particular region. So this is just, I'm not intending for you to consume the details of this graphic, but to show the kind of detailed analysis that you could do. Here are a number of different dimensions of ND Gain. In this case, V stands for dimensions that are part of vulnerability. R stands for pieces of readiness. And we could compare, in this case, say 5 different countries. And we could say, along these different dimensions that are important to me as a bottling company, how do my different countries rank and compare? So an index should enable this kind of analysis and visualization. And we were going to talk in this panel about future trends. Where are indices and tools going? ND Gain, of course, has a future ahead of it, and there are a number of things that we're planning, and we think we're representative of tool development in general. We're looking to downscale. A lot of indicators of climate change adaptation, and there's been discussion on previous panels about a lot of adaptation action being at the local scale. So we need to provide that information to decision makers at finer resolution. We need, and also in the last panel discussed about putting data in the hands of people who want to use it and in a customizable way that makes sense to them. It's one thing to provide information, it's another thing to allow a user to consume the information that's most important to them. We also are interested in working on developing case studies to help people understand the utility of tools. Just because a tool is available doesn't mean that anyone knows how to use it or how best to apply it. And the other is we want to indicate large ideas, but we also want to be able to have specific utility. ND Gain covers a variety of sectors: water, food, infrastructure, ecosystems, and so on, health. But we can also dig down into those individual indicators to get a sense of what is the food and water situation for an individual country, let's say. So these are examples of future trends as we see them at ND Gain. And with that, I'm going to turn over the slides to our first panelist, and we'll hear from each of our respective panelists. Stephen, please.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll stick on this slide for a minute or two.
You tell me when to advance.
Will do. Thank you very much. And I swear I had nothing to do with the 2 plugs just a moment ago. But thank you very much to Cynthia. CSR Hub is a carbon software partner to CDP. So we do have a number of alliances with different organizations out there, and they are one of them. And Cristiana Figueres has been a huge supporter of CDP throughout the years. She's spoken on our global forums, but I had nothing to do with that plug there in that film. Just wanted to say thank you quickly for having CDP here. I think it's a great opportunity for us to talk about the value of what I heard before, data collection, which is then converted into information development. Data, if it sits in a black box, sits on itself, is not useful to anybody. So increasingly at CDP, we're trying to find avenues to find the best and most mileage out of the data that companies do disclose. This is companies as well as cities. So we've grown our programs to now include a large group of cities, 110 in this past year of disclosure. Most of them are the C40 large global cities. There are very small cities with very low populations as well. The next slide. But by offering a global disclosure mechanism, which is now including natural capital, not just climate change, but also water and deforestation related issues, what we're doing is providing an opportunity for companies and cities to provide the story. So rather than just providing the numbers of your greenhouse gas emissions or the water you're consuming and how much you're recycling, the strategy behind the numbers are really important to your stakeholders. And so that's really the value of the CDP process, is to go deeper than just those quantification, the quantification component of your reporting. So what does this do? That story provides a glimpse into the intricacies of your carbon management strategy, your water management strategy, a pulse on your understanding of the related risks and opportunities, as well as the insights into the actions that companies and cities are taking to manage those risks. So going to the thought about adaptation, understanding what is adaptation in and of itself, it's dealing with a current problem. We do ask companies and cities to mention the risks that they're currently faced, the cost of those risks, and the actions that they're taking to manage those risks. So that information is available within the CDP system, and I'd be happy to help you find that. Next slide. So just for a quick backdrop, we at CDP have been in development for about 13 years, requesting disclosure since 2002, launching our first report in 2003 from companies in the Global 500 Index. There are now about 5,000 companies just under that are disclosing worldwide in over 65 countries. representing about 70% of the S&P 500, 82 or 81% depending on the year of the global 500. But thinking about what does that mean in terms of global terms, that's over half of the world's listed market capitalization. So we've now hit a very significant point, and we're starting to go deeper into the work that we do and looking at more in sector-specific approaches. But the ways that investors use the data, it's important to take a look at the different ways, because there's more than just one, and there's a variety, and not all investors in different geographies are using it exactly the same way, or using the CDP disclosure system in the same way. So I think primarily they're using it to rank, score, and compare companies, either directly taking the CDP data or going to our partners such as Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters, Sustainalytics, TrueCost, any of these folks that are taking data from multiple sources, integrating that into broader ESG metrics. They're also using our indices. So CDP reestablished our leadership group of companies. It's important to do this every year. Companies like competition. They like to be on the top of the list. So we do this for two key metrics. One is disclosure transparency, and one is the performance, the actions you're taking to manage climate change. And if you look at these indexes that we establish, which they're based on the performance in the top companies in disclosure, they outperform financially. If you take a backcasted look of their performance on financial markets, they outperform the benchmark indexes. And we've done this analysis for Global 500, S&P 500, and in Canada we have a sample as well that we've done this for. They also use it for company engagement. So arguably, if you're talking to a company that is a poor performer on CDP, they don't rank very well, maybe this is a good opportunity for you as an investor to engage with that company and help them see the path that you want them to go down when it comes to climate, water, deforestation-related sustainability. There's also companies that are using this for exclusion and divestment criteria, so actually taking stocks out of their portfolios if they don't meet their standards. It could be as simple as not disclosing the CDP, which would be the very extreme case, or it could be the fact that a company is not reacting to a request from an investor to improve on certain areas of their disclosure. There's also development of ESG metrics, which I spoke about before, taking this and incorporating it into larger environmental, social, and governance criteria, as well as managing risks. So taking a look at your portfolio as an investor and trying to analyze where the risks are within your portfolio, and then trying to find the best in class type of companies that could potentially replace those investments. Next slide. Well, I did have just one more thing, and I don't have a slide on it, but wanted to quickly talk about the cities program. We had, as I mentioned, about 110 cities this past year disclose, and it's not happening so much now, but it will begin to occur as we've had storms like Superstorm Sandy that have clearly affected the ability for a city to have business continuity. And there are losses not just to the physical environment, but to the businesses and their operations that happen within those cities. So in New York State last year, New York State and municipalities sold about $44.5 billion worth of municipal bonds, worth of bonds in 2012. And this is according to Bloomberg, and that's the most since 2003. So the investment is increasing, it is very high. And as these storms continue to increase, how does that affect the way that municipal bonds are rated in their risk assessment? So that's a question that those risk agencies will determine. So more understanding of these issues equals more demand. And that's what we're seeing in this slide here. So when CDP began back in 2003, there was a very small group of investors that were on that vanguard that said, we need more information about our holdings. We don't have this information available to us. So the CDP tool was to sit there and say, okay, let's ask the right questions. And gradually we built from a one-page questionnaire to a multi-page questionnaire. But going from 35 investors in 2003, 4.5 trillion in assets at that point, to now 722 investors, 87 trillion in assets. In the US alone, we have 124 institutional investors with 21 trillion in assets. So next slide. The risks that are being disclosed by US companies, and what this is maybe a complicated slide to take a look at now, but just to summarize a few very key points. For US companies in the S&P 500, risks could include changes to the physical environment, and that could be a result of extreme weather events. It could occur from regulatory changes, so that could be cap and trade, carbon tax, as well as consumer preference behavior changes. In the US, 63% of these risks that were reported are near term. They're going to happen in the next 1 to 5 years, according to companies. And 75% of them are expected to impact their direct operations. 3/4. And then furthermore, the costs are being understood. So it's not just the risks exist, but the risks are expected to have operational costs as well as to reduce the demand for current goods and services. Next slide. And then in cities, as I mentioned, New York City, Hurricane Sandy amounted to $19 billion in damages. This is reported by the city of New York in their past disclosure. They also reported that they expect the probability of a storm causing New York City as much damage will increase by 17% by 2020s and 40% by 2050s. Chicago is another example. What they're doing is they're investing in creating jobs and in economic growth through sustainability. They're doing this to build a more healthier, livable city that they're hoping will attract additional investment. They're expecting $8 billion in public and private investments over the next decade as a result of that activity. Next slide. So as I mentioned, what is a data set without it being a source of information and a source of insights? So I think it's critical to think about who could this inform and what types of decisions could those be that they're informing. So as a raw data set, it is available. You can access that. You can use that, manipulate it in your own way, rank a company based on how many companies in the energy sector are setting targets, as we heard about before, pricing on carbon, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But there also are partners that provide ESG analytics, as I mentioned. We've done a few things in the past year in CDP North America to try to bring this data out and make it usable and contextual for different groups of our stakeholders. One of them being the corporate community. So if you're a company and you're wondering, how do I reduce emissions but do it profitably? We've done an analysis of the emission reduction activities that have been disclosed through CDP from the US corporate sector. And we've analyzed out of those companies with WWF and McKinsey, we've taken a look to understand can reductions according to the climate science predictions of 2 degrees increase in Celsius, can the US corporate sector reduce those emissions and do so profitably? The reported emission reduction activities by the US corporate sector indicated that yes, it can be done, and we provided a roadmap for how that can be done through energy efficiency and renewable energy investments. And this is all being done, this all can be done profitably by the year 2020. Another piece of insight is for the investment community. Sustainable Insight Capital Management was our partner for this report. What we did was we tried to take a look at leading companies on disclosure engagement. And so these are the companies that rank in the top of our leadership indexes. It's important to try to find value in that leadership effort. And so what we did was we took a look at some 3 key metrics: return on equity, dividend growth, and cash flow stability. In each one of those key investment criteria, the companies that are leading in disclosure engagement outperformed the benchmark, and we did this with the Global 500 index. And then for policy decision makers, we heard from this from Cynthia. Thank you very much. I don't have to go into all that much detail. But pulling out and extracting those components of the story is really important. And so carbon pricing, we've been asking this question for a number of years, but we never did anything with it. And arguably, companies have been pricing carbon in the US for many years now. But it's important to pull that out and show which companies are actually planning for that and using that in their planning for their corporations in the future, but also reporting that it will not, or at least they're not citing that it will impact their business in any negative way by having those prices. So that's just a quick summary of what CDP does and how we try to bring the data out from just being data and into information that can be used for decision making. So really thinking of it as a tool and how it can be utilized by different stakeholder groups. So look forward to your questions in just a little bit. Thank you.
Yep.
Your first slide.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and it's been really interesting to learn about the work that you all are doing. And I think that this will appear to be a little bit of an outlier in this group, in that the Ocean Health Index is not explicitly about adaptation. So I want to just get that out front. But I think there's a lot of commonalities that we all face in the design of these kinds of indices and how to design them so that we incorporate management levers into them, and we face a lot of similar challenges. So I think it is really helpful to kind of be able to learn from each other and see how other people approach similar types of challenges. So the Ocean Health Index is, although I'm speaking about it today, is really the work of about 65 scientists. And we designed it as a tool for trying to assess the health of our oceans. And we did this based on a very specific definition. Next slide. This definition is so important because it was really foundational to how we designed the index and how it affected a lot of the decisions we made about its design. So our definition is a healthy ocean is one that delivers a range of benefits to people now and in the future. And I want to point out a couple of things about this definition. One is that we're talking about a range of benefits. So we designed the index to look at a portfolio of benefits that people have for a healthy ocean. And the other is this idea of now and into the future. So we tried to design the index in such a way that we wouldn't be maximizing short-term benefits at the expense of long-term benefits. So just to get those things out there and think about them as I talk about some of our results. Next slide. So that portfolio of benefits that I referenced, we looked at the ability of the ocean to deliver sustainably benefits across 10 goals that people have for a healthy ocean. So it's a little hard to read. So those 10 goals are artisanal fishing opportunities, biodiversity, coastal protection, carbon storage, clean waters, food provision, tourism and recreation, coastal livelihoods and economies, natural products, and sense of place. Within a few of those goals, we look at sub-goals, but I think those 10 goals represent sort of the broad base of things that we were trying to assess in the index. So the global score is 65, which indicates a lot of room for improvement because it's out of 100. So, and I wanted to just mention a couple things about how we designed the index. So each of the goal scores, you can see, for example, we calculate a score for each of our goals. So artisanal fishing opportunities here is 95. And each goal score includes a measure of status, and our status looks at a present state relative to a reference point or target. And the development of those reference points was a real challenge, but they're so foundational to what makes, I think, the index useful as a management tool because it explicitly incorporates a target. So that constitutes 50% of a goal score. The other 50% of the goal score is based on the trend in the status over the last 5 years, the pressures on that status, of which climate is one, and we incorporated data on temperature and ocean acidification. And the third piece of that is what we refer to as resilience, which includes governance mechanisms or management that could mitigate those pressures. So we refer to this sort of package of trends, pressures, and resilience as an indication of the goal's likely future state, which is sort of where we think it's heading in the next 5 years. And we recalculate that every year. Next slide. So this is the global index scores for 2013. And you can see a couple of interesting spatial patterns. One is that the exclusive economic zones of West Africa and Southeast Asia include some of the lower scores. The colors are a little hard to see. But I think that largely reflects very low scores for fisheries and food provision, and also low resilience scores. So our work suggests that the governance mechanisms are not necessarily in place to really mitigate the pressures that a lot of these ocean systems are facing. Some of the higher scores you can see are in some relatively uninhabited and unimpacted parts of the oceans, but we also had relatively high scores in places like Germany, and other developed countries that have developed effective environmental policies for mitigating a lot of these impacts. Next slide. In addition to visualizing things as maps, one of the things that we do to visualize our data is the use of these petal plots. So this is all of the same type of information that was contained in the previous two slides, but I think this is really useful for a couple of things that we feel are really important in terms of management guidance that the index can provide. So each of the slices of the pie, so to speak, the ones that extend furthest out to the edge have the highest scores, and the ones that have the lowest scores are closest in. So I think one of the things that makes this a useful visualization is that over time you can see whether or not an increase in one goal has resulted in the decrease of another goal. So we expect, and the index is designed to show some of these trade-offs, so that if you, for example, have an increase in fisheries production, you may see a decrease in biodiversity. Another thing that I think is really useful here is that it highlights when we do these for each country, you can see that there are many different paths to sustainability. So even though many countries may have the same score, their goal scores are actually quite different. So there's a lot of different paths to getting to a sustainable future for the oceans. And next slide. Because this is a very short introduction to the Ocean Health Index, I'd encourage you to check out our website, which enables you to dig into some of the data, some of the visualizations for each country, and also include some information about our upcoming work, which includes the development of a toolbox so that countries and policymakers can put in data themselves and try and do some of their own sort of ground up calculations of the index. We really don't want to be the sole calculators of the index, because we don't feel that it's a sustainable thing in terms of being able to give guidance to policymakers. We've also been focusing on the downscaling. We have a few case studies that we're doing in different countries around the world, including the west coast of the US, Brazil, Fiji, with some other ones planned in the next couple of years. So I encourage you to check out the website, and thank you very much for having me here.
All right, Ian.
Okay, can you just put up the first slide, and I won't use the rest until near the end.
Okay. You let me know when.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and the importance of this slide I hope will become clearer near the end of my comments. But let me firstly just say how I got to be sitting here. I started out as a pure research scientist, got interested in how landscapes developed with grazing animals, with fire, and then with climate change. And as the breadth got wider, I found myself moving from doing science to having to lead scientific teams. And an opportunity came along to do a 1-year secondment with the bank to actually use science. Well, that 1 year spread to 12, and I'm still here in Washington. But I have retired from the bank, and while at the bank I had many discussions that actually Amy almost gave a perfect description of some of those discussions that I had. Beware of indices, certainly in the adaptation area. They can be misleading, there can be problems. At one stage, one of my directors said, "I'm sorry, but I do want to have evidence that the least developed countries are the most vulnerable to climate change." And yes, that we could do, and we developed such a data set to demonstrate that quite clearly. As I was about to leave the bank, at the same time, about the same time as Juan Jose was about to leave the bank, he came to me and said, "I want you to come and work with me on developing an index for adaptation," which seemed a very strange request to be asking me to do something like that. But as you might have noted, Juan Jose is an enthusiast and he's persuasive. And also, he had a different idea. He wanted an index that should be used to raise awareness, basically, and also an index which was focused as much on the private sector, if not more on the private sector, than on the public sector. And as someone who has been saying all the time, we need to raise awareness and adaptation, and we need to engage the private sector, then I felt I had to be engaged in such a project. Now, I had many questions, and I think actually Joyce Coffey's comments at the beginning of this meeting, which she felt that in her course you'll come out with more questions than answers, or I can't quite remember your quote. I think that's what raising awareness leads to. Raising awareness does not lead to an answer, and a simple answer, and the belief in the result of that index or your ranking, but to questions as to, well, why does my country rank here? Why is it like this? What is leading to this? And that to me is the power of having an index like this. Underneath that index is a very rich database. There are about 50 measures that go into the index at the moment. I have about 500 adaptation relevant measures sitting on my computer that we drew upon and used some, rejected some for all sorts of reasons. You maybe hear more about that later. It's also on the web. One of the questions that we have to tackle all along is also, why are we trying to measure something as vague and disputed as terms like vulnerability, or, as some people would prefer to say, resilience? It's the flip side. If I'd made that statement just then in front of a group of scientists, I would have started an argument straight away, because some people will tell you in great detail why vulnerability and resilience are very different concepts. So the academic community is not in agreement in this area. One is I also wanted to introduce the concept of readiness. Now, what does that mean? Now, after a lot of thought, we agreed that essentially what we're talking about was the ability of a country to absorb investment, either by the government or by an MDB or by the private sector, and use it effectively to reduce that country's vulnerability. Now, there are many other ways that readiness can be defined, and you can have different target groups. You could look more at the philanthropic community. You look at more at assisting NGOs in doing some of the tasks that they're doing. So that's how we define readiness and gain in this situation. Now, there are many other ways that indices can be used. One of the points we made clear right from the outset was that gain was not meant to be an allocation index. Be one of the very reasons why I thought we should not develop such an index in the bank. Even if it was not meant to be used for allocation, it would be seen that way and possibly even used that way, which would be a misuse of it. However, in the longer run, we can't afford to walk away from that issue, because Jessica's already mentioned the Green Climate Fund. Now, the Green Climate Fund has been agreed to in the climate change negotiations. Whether it will come into, well, it exists already. The Secretariat is being set up in South Korea at the moment. The goal is $100 billion per year in mitigation and adaptation, with roughly a 50-50 split, so $50 billion a year for adaptation. Now, most people do not believe they'll get to those sorts of numbers, but I think everyone agrees that we have to get close to that if the climate change talks are to go ahead. Otherwise the least developed countries or the developing countries are likely simply to walk away. Now, tens of billions of dollars per year cannot be handled without some form of allocation formula. A number of countries have foreseen this already, and in fact they've come to GAIN and to me to ask, how do we go about doing allocation? So we can't get away from the allocation issue. But that was not what the GAIN index was produced for. The GAIN index was produced to gain awareness, to develop a sense of, well, why is my country where it is? Why isn't it ranking above another country? What factors are pushing my country down or up? And people like Juan Jose have used this very, very effectively. I think the profile of adaptation in places like the World Economic Forum have gone up enormously because he's had a tool like this to use. Another way that the indices like this can be used is understanding adaptation better. Asking some of the questions I was just then. I mean, why are things the way they are? What can my country do to improve the situation? What might be the most effective way of going ahead? Why do we differ from that country? Now, this sort of analysis, I think, is just barely started. One of the decisions we made in developing the GAIN index was that we would not use any measure which included GDP per capita. One, I don't like GDP as a measure to start with, but many developing countries had argued that we're being penalised twice in many of these indices, not just indices around adaptation, but all sorts of poverty indices, etc. Because GDP per capita appears in it, and we're poor, and therefore we're low. And then they throw in a whole lot of other factors associated with being in poverty, and therefore we're doubly penalised. So we decided to keep it out of the GAIN index. Interestingly enough, the GAIN index actually correlates very highly with GDP per capita, which I guess you'd have to expect because poverty and vulnerability and lack of readiness are all linked. But that was an outcome, not an input. We also decided not to use any of the recent data collection on the impact of climate change disaster, or climate-related disasters on countries, because we wanted to keep that firstly as a second set of data to get people interested in looking further into information, but also to check whether the index itself had any meaning. I'll come to that in a second. So the core purpose of GAIN is really to get people asking those questions. But to do that, we had to have a product that we knew had at least some solid basis in the science behind it. So have the next slide. We'll have the first slide. So one of the first questions that we had to ask was, how do you actually form an index? Now, this is a technical question. Do you just simply get a lot of measures and add them up and divide by the number of measures? Do you actually use a geometric mean? You multiply them all together and take the nth root. Do you use more complex things? Do you use a ranking system? Now, the academic community can go on about this for forever. But here's just one simple example. Here's the GAIN index calculated one way as essentially an additive average, and the other way where we simply did a ranking and summed the ranks and did it that way. And you'll see that, yes, there's a scatter, but there's not a huge difference between the two methodologies. Next slide. We also recognised, well, one of the important issues about GAIN was that it was to be a time series. We were to go back to have data back to 1995, and I believe we could probably go back a little bit beyond before that if needed. And but of course, there's a lot of missing data in that. Countries are not reporting many of the measures right even now. And the question was, can we get by with a certain amount of missing data? And here's a result of some analyses, some simulations, where I simply asked, I took out 1/3 at random, 1/3 of the measures that went into the GAIN index and calculated the scores and ranked the countries. And I did this hundreds of times, basically. And what you see here is the outcome. Now, the question I was asking is, would the most vulnerable 25 countries stay up there amongst the most vulnerable countries, and vice versa, would the least vulnerable countries stay there? If the index had been perfect, you would have seen a line which came out from the 100 and just got to 25 and plummeted down to the base and then went across. If it was just a purely random, you'd see the lines as they occurs. So in fact, it does show that even up to 1/3 of missing data doesn't actually change the outcome hugely. So we could afford to work with some missing data in the whole process, and therefore do the index for, I think we would do 177 countries out of 192 UN, sorry, now it's 193, South Sudan is going to be a problem, countries. So things like that have been tested. Next one. Does the GAIN index, and here the vulnerability component of it, does it actually relate to climate-related disasters? Remember, we said none of that went into the input, and here you see that if you have low vulnerability on the left, you have a low probability as an individual of being affected by a climate-related disaster in that country. So it does correlate and does show some back projections of current risks. Next one. We did the same with readiness. Now, this was a bit more problematic because when we first looked at it, we said, we can't find that readiness really correlates with anything very sensible. Looked at foreign direct investment, for example. No. We looked at how much countries were receiving from the multilateral development banks. No relationship. Here we also looked at GDP growth, the percentage growth per year. No relationship when we first looked at it, until we split it into the least developed countries and the middle income countries versus the developed countries. And you can see that there is, it's small, but there is definitely a trend upwards as the countries that are more ready are growing faster. I think there's a lot more work to be done on readiness, but there is some message there already. Interesting question, why it is that the developed countries go the other way. Now, here's a question for the researchers to look further into this. And next slide. I've mentioned the fact that the challenge of allocation is there, and it's going to have to be faced. A couple of countries have come to me and said, we cannot go to our taxpayers and say we're putting some billions of dollars a year into an adaptation fund and not be able to demonstrate that there is some sound basis for making that allocation. So we do need to have some methodology. Other organisations have faced the same problem. Obviously, the development banks have faced this for a long while and have developed indices. They've been debated, modified, debated again, modified, but they are used and they have reasonable effectiveness. The GEF, Global Environment Fund, has had to develop certain allocation formulae. This shows you the relationship between two indices, the gain index and one developed by David, what can his name? I'm going to say Freeman. Sorry, it doesn't matter. What's what there? David Wheeler, sorry. People say, well, there's some relationship between those indices. Does it matter which one we use? Well, yes, it does, because use one index, one country would get 200 million, use another index and only get 100 million. And I can tell you that that would take some negotiations to get any one of those through. But this is a challenge we're going to have to face within the allocation area. It's not something that ND Gain has to face. That's a decision up to them, but it's one that the whole community will have to face. Next slide. And press it again. And now we're back to these two people. Because, in fact, the index is just that. It's an index. It is one way of presenting information. It's a window into asking more questions about why are things the way they are. Now, I was fortunate to spend the last 2 weeks, in fact, we got back about 10 o'clock last night, but 2 weeks in Australia, travelling with a group of leaders from developing countries and from different levels in those developing countries. We had essentially chieftains from Zambia who were advising both the government and also their own tribal groups on what to do on adaptation. We had a leader representing all of the NGOs in Samoa and many other Pacific countries, who was also essentially part of the Samoan, I don't know what you call it, the royal family, but the links there. We had people from Bangladesh who've been running the Bangladesh Adaptation Fund. And we brought all these people together to talk with groups in Australia, leaders who'd come forward there. In Australia, there is an Aboriginal community called the Yorta Yorta community. They have challenged both the rights to their land and the rights to actually help manage the adaptation of their land right through to the High Court or the Supreme Court equivalent. Unfortunately, they lost in their case. It was a case that was probably going to be lost, but they carried it through to that point. But they talked about how they wanted to manage their land and how they might go about it. They have charismatic leaders who have led through this whole process. But it was interesting to see this discussion that finally developed between the chieftains from Zambia, the lady from Samoa, talking to the Yorta Yorta people and saying, stop being victims. You've got so many good things going for you here. You've got new ideas. You've got, for example, you're losing your Indigenous knowledge, you're losing the knowledge of the elders. children do not want to go out and be educated in the old ways, but in a new way that they've developed instead. They take an iPhone and a teenager and put them with an elder, and they go out and the elder tells them the stories while the whole thing is recorded on the iPhone, and both video and sound. Now, a lot of that is secret information. So a software package has been developed so the elders can control that information. They can control when they release it, if they ever release it. But it at least is being recorded, and of course the children are becoming engaged. So we have to get the multiple generations engaged. But when I look, the little bit of this they showed us, it was often about how many yams used to grow here, how big was the river then. It was about information. And so much of the exchange between all of those people was about information. Not the sort of information that will go into the gain index, but it does bring back this importance of information and appropriate information for appropriate reasons. And I think that is the challenge that we all have to face. The challenge with ND gain is where they want to take the gain index at the moment. I think a lot more research needs to be done about what has been put into the index so far. But I think what is a lot more important is how do you help people when they go to that next step? Juan Jose has got them enthused. Then they ask the questions of, why is my country like this? Can I see more information? Can you show it to me in a way that's meaningful to me? I think that's the challenge with ND gain, and I'm happy to continue to help them while I can, but happy also, as in this community here, Mr. Grasley hand over. It's a pity that photograph's taken in that direction because it was taken in the Wadi Rum in Jordan. And if you know Wadi Rum, that's where Lawrence Arabia was filmed, so when you looked out the other direction, there was some magnificent scenery. But they are asking, how do we keep this, and how do we keep this part of our lifestyle? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So we'll, I want to ask one small question of each of you, and then I'd like to open the floor to the audience. And this question is inspired, Stephen, actually by your referencing how you looked at your data to show examples of people doing things and achieving certain outcomes. I'm wondering if each of you might be able to cite an example that you know of data or index, perhaps your own index, being used in a particular application that you think advanced decision making or raised awareness or some specific case. So can you cite a case for us that ties information and delivery of that information to a decision or some sort of advancement?
Yeah, and just because we're an investor organization, at least that's where we began, I'll take an investor perspective on this. And so it's actually a distant example. It's on the other side of the world almost, in South Africa. A bank called Nedbank has taken a look at the rankings of companies that are disclosing that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Pretty simple methodology. What they did, they created an index, a green index, based upon the top companies in terms of the transparency of their disclosure as the initial point, of which they would say that the companies above this point are eligible to be included in this index and those below are not. The second part of it was they then took the weighting of how well they performed. So the actions they were taking to mitigate their impact on climate change, if they were verifying their emissions, a few different criteria related to setting targets and meeting those targets, things that go into the actions, so the performance side of managing climate change. And that's the other side of our scoring methodology. So we have those two scores. They took above that threshold for transparency, and then when it came to performance, they weighted the companies that were the top performers, and we do this by letter band, A, B, C, D. And then, so what happened was the index was heavily weighted on the companies that were top disclosures, top performers. And when you take a look at that ETF, the exchange traded fund that is based on that index that Nedbank provides, it outperforms the standard or the benchmark index, Johannesburg Stock Exchange group of companies, by over 30%. And so then it's a question of liquidity, and it's a question of how many investors are buying that ETF and how much is it being transacted. But I think that's an example of a way that you can take a look at an index, or you can take a look at a ranking system and start to utilize it for your specific practice, this one being the investment community.
Yeah, so the Ocean Health Index was released in 2012. And as you might imagine, when it came out, some countries were particularly unhappy when they had relatively low scores. I think the fact that we looked across the sort of portfolio of benefits has led to a lot of conversations between different policy-making bodies within those countries that don't traditionally talk to each other around the issue of ocean health. So, for example, Colombia was not happy with their score, and the government directed ministers from various different ministries to come together to discuss the data issues, why they were scoring so poorly, whether or not they could bring new data to bear, how they could work together to improve the scores. And simply having those players around the table talking about issues related to ocean health was, I think, a deeply motivating thing to see, and I think will help to catalyze some change, hopefully, in the future.
Well, just in relation to the gain index, as it was then, ND gain hasn't been released as yet. I have, on a number of occasions, had to answer the question, why have you rated us like that, to what can we do about this? And that's led to interesting discussions. I'm sure one has had even more like that. But another example is that I was involved with through one of my last tasks at the bank, with the League of Arab States, where they wanted an analysis done of their adaptation options across all of the Arab countries. And we found ourselves initially going to governments and doing long explanations about how countries differed. And so finally, I simply produced the gain index data for them. I showed them both the vulnerability and the readiness. And that was a very useful starting graph to work with people. It immediately opened up the questions exactly the way I think that it was originally designed to do. So that I think was the opener for a much better dialogue. Everywhere from Saudi Arabia to Tunisia.
Mm-hmm. All right, questions from the audience. We have one, please, toward the back. Ira.
Yes, it's Ira again.
Please.
I have a quick question both for Stephen and for Elizabeth. Stephen, would you agree that it's easier to construct an index when the stock exchange itself requires certain types of disclosure just to be listed on that stock exchange, as in the case of Johannesburg? And Elizabeth, from the definition of your mission statement and then the different goals, it's very clear that it's an ecosystem services oriented model, and I was just wondering why you don't use that phrase in your public presentations. Thanks.
I guess I'll go first. Thanks, Ira. I would agree. I mean, I think there is a movement amongst exchanges to try to position themselves or understand their role in encouraging sustainability disclosure, in particular for greenhouse gas emissions or environmental disclosure, which is CDP's part of the equation. Absolutely, it helps to have the exchange behind you. There are other exchanges that are not necessarily requiring it, but it's more of a disclose or explain why not. On the flip side of it, however, I mean, in a situation like in the UK, when they decided to implement rules to require reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, it was easy for them to do it because companies were already disclosing through CDP and other systems. So the fact that we existed, the fact that companies were already engaged in this made it easier. So I think it goes both ways. We sort of enabled each other in a way.
So the question that relates to why we don't sort of frame it more in an ecosystem services context. A couple of things to point out. One is that even though several of the goals suggest an ecosystem service provision, we also have like a biodiversity goal, which is dealing more with the existence value and more of a traditional conservation perspective. So it's a mix, but also by design, we envisioned and wanted this to serve as a new conception of health that includes human beings and sort of a socio-ecological coupled system, because we don't think that you can really separate ocean health from human behavior and vice versa. So sometimes when I give a longer version of this presentation, I show a feedback loop that shows, you know, that human health has consequences for ocean health has consequences for ecosystem service provision has consequences for human health. So we were really hoping and had kind of a secondary motivation for really trying to advance the idea of health from just a pure ecosystem perspective towards one that looked at this really through a coupled system view.
You know, Ira, I think a powerful thing about indices too is that they could take something that's quite conceptual. Ecosystem services is a really informative, somewhat transformative concept, but it's awfully fuzzy too. And an index can say, here are the components that we are talking about. Or in the case of gain, ND gain, we could say, Ian referenced vulnerability and readiness. They're kind of lofty ideas. But here are the things we are using to measure them, which puts some meat on the bones of a concept analogous to ecosystem services, I think.